I have spent a lifetime watching people confuse a rising number on paper with a rising standard of living. Those are not the same thing. A man can look at his bank account, see more pounds, more dollars, more digits than he saw last year, and still discover that his life has become narrower, thinner, and more expensive in every direction that matters. That is where I want to begin. Because when most people hear the phrase currency crisis, they imagine some dramatic scene from a history book. They imagine wheelbarrows full of notes. They imagine a collapsing government, a panicked crowd, and headlines that scream catastrophe only after the damage has already been done. That is not how it usually begins. It begins quietly. It begins with people noticing that the official story no longer matches the life they are living. It begins when the people in charge insist inflation is under control while your grocery basket shrinks, your coffee package gets smaller, your travel gets more expensive, your insurance keeps climbing, your rent or house payment takes a larger bite, and the savings account that was supposed to represent prudence quietly loses purchasing power faster than it earns interest. It begins when people stop trusting what they are told and start trusting what they can see. And what they can see right now is not good. I think there is a serious chance that we are in the early stage of a broad currency problem, not confined to one country and not limited to one market, but spreading through the developed world. In the same way rot spreads through timber. It may show up first in Britain, it may show up most visibly in Europe, it may show up through bond markets, through property markets, through consumer prices, through gold, through energy, through the public's changing behavior. But the disease is larger than any one nation. The disease is this. Governments have discovered that inflation is politically easier than discipline. That is the center of the whole matter. People are taught to think inflation is some kind of weather system. It blows in, it blows out. Central bankers stand nobly under umbrellas fighting the storm. That is a fairy tale designed to preserve confidence. Inflation is not an accident. Inflation is policy. Governments create it because governments spend beyond what productive citizens can fund. Honestly, central banks enable it because the political class wants promises kept without the pain of taxation or austerity. And then, once the inflation appears, those same institutions spend their time managing perception rather than solving the source of the problem. That game works for a while. Then it doesn't. T. Ludwig von Mises described the final stage of that process better than almost anyone. He explained that eventually the public wakes up, not all at once, not because of one speech or one report. They wake up because they begin to understand that the quantity of money is going to keep increasing and that the policy will not stop. Once they believe that, money changes character. It stops feeling like a store of value and starts feeling like a melting cube of ice in your hand. At that point, people do not want money. They want anything but money. They want goods. They want land. They want inventory. They want gold. They want tools. They want productive assets. They want something that cannot be printed by a committee. That final rush away from currency is what Mises called the crack. Up boom. It is not a healthy boom. It is not real prosperity. It is a panic masquerading as growth because people are not buying things merely because they need them. They are buying because holding the currency feels more dangerous than owning the thing that distinction matters. A lot of people still think inflation is whatever the latest CPI release tells them it is. I have never found that to be a serious way to think. CPI is a lagging, massaged, politically useful abstraction. It can be reweighted, softened, revised, and explained away. But the one thing that cannot be explained away forever is the quantity of money itself. If you want to understand inflation, you do not begin with the press conference. You begin with the money supply. You begin with the central bank balance sheet. You begin with the fiscal deficit. You begin with the question every sensible investor should ask. Where is the government going to get the money to keep all of its promises without taking it directly from me? In a way I can see, in Britain, broad money has already pushed back to new highs after the huge expansion of 2020. In the United States, the central bank balance sheet has stopped shrinking in the way people hoped and has begun swelling. Again, in Britain, the Bank of England's balance sheet bottomed and then stopped declining. That is not the behavior of a system being restored to hard money discipline. That is the behavior of a system being quietly refilled with liquidity, because the authorities know what happens if they tighten too much. They know what sits on the other side of honesty, deflation, recession, asset repricing, fiscal pain, and politicians hate visible pain, so they choose hidden pain instead. That hidden pain is the dilution of money. Now add energy to the equation. Oil futures on a screen tell one story. Physical oil tells another. During periods of real strain, the so-called market price can become little more than a reference point, while actual delivered barrels change hands at much higher effective numbers. If the barrel that reaches the end user costs vastly more than the polite price flashing on a terminal, then the published quote is not the truth that governs real life. The real life truth is the marginal replacement cost that businesses and households must absorb. And when energy costs stay high, everything downstream feels it. Factories feel it, transport feels it, supermarkets feel it, restaurants feel it, home heating feels it, travel feels it. The entire cost structure of an economy begins to buckle upward. But even then, I would not make the mistake of saying oil causes inflation. Oil can trigger price shocks. It can accelerate the experience of inflation. It can reveal how fragile a system is. But the long, broad, persistent destruction of purchasing power comes from monetary and fiscal policy. It comes from governments that spend too much, borrow too much, crowd out private production, penalize investment in real energy supply, and then act surprised when shortages and higher prices appear. A country can spend years sabotaging its own productive capacity and then blame the visible symptom rather than the policy that produced it. That does not change the arithmetic. If you suppress exploration, you get less supply. If you discourage capital formation, you get less resilience. If you expand money faster than output, you get less purchasing power per unit of currency. There is nothing mystical about that. One of the most revealing indicators I watch is the ratio between the average house price and gold. I like that ratio because it strips away the illusion created by nominal prices. A house price in pounds can rise, a house price in dollars can rise, but if the house is actually getting cheaper relative to a hard asset that cannot be printed, the nominal gain is telling you less than you think. For years I watched the long British house price to gold ratio with a simple question in mind. Would it ever break below the old lows that marked previous monetary stress? And now it has done exactly that. Think carefully about what that means. Either gold had to move a great deal, or house prices had to move a great deal, or both. And when both are moving while the currency keeps losing credibility, what you are seeing is not healthy wealth creation. You are seeing people flee the measuring stick. That is one of the signatures of a crack. Up, boom. People think a house is rising in value. Sometimes it is. But often the house is merely standing still while the currency beneath it sinks. That is a very different experience from real wealth creation. And if you do not understand the difference, you can become satisfied with nominal gains while becoming poorer in real terms. This is also why I have always had respect for ownership of monetary metals in forms that are efficient for the holder. In Britain, legal tender gold coins have certain tax advantages that matter. I do not bring that up because I want anyone to behave like a zealot. I bring it up because once a society moves from confidence to suspicion, details that once looked trivial start to matter a lot. Structure matters, jurisdiction matters, liquidity matters, tax treatment matters. When the world is normal, those things feel secondary. When the world stops being normal, they stop being secondary. Now let me tell you where I would least like to be if this process keeps advancing. I would least like to be in cash. And right behind cash, I would least like to be in long government bonds. That surprises people because cash feels prudent and government bonds feel respectable. One gives the illusion of safety because the number does not go down. The other gives the illusion of seriousness because it is backed by the state. But if the currency itself is the thing being sacrificed, cash is simply a slowly melting claim on a system that is already telling you it will choose debasement over reform. And government bonds are often worse than cash in that setting because they can hand you a double injury. You get paid back in a weaker currency, and you can also lose principal as yields rise. A great many people have never lived through a secular bond bear market, so they underestimate how brutal that can be. When yields rise, existing bond prices fall. That is not opinion, that is mechanics. If you bought a 10-year government bond yielding 5 and the market suddenly demands 6, your old bond is worth less because nobody will pay full price for an inferior stream of income. The math forces the price down until the effective yield becomes competitive. So the saver who thought he was being conservative discovers that he has locked capital into an asset that can both lose market value and lose real purchasing power at the same time. That is not my definition of safety. And there is a deeper problem in a long disinflationary era. Falling yields help nearly everything. They help housing affordability through financing. They help credit expansion. They help asset multiples. They help balance sheets look cleaner than they really are. But once that trend reverses and yields begin a secular rise, all those old tailwinds become headwinds. The machine that levitated financial assets for decades starts to work in reverse. That is why people who keep their savings in cash and government paper during a true currency deterioration often feel confused. They say, "But I didn't speculate, I didn't gamble, I did the safe thing." Yes, and the safe thing in one regime can become the dangerous thing in another. Regimes change. You are not paid for loyalty to a dead environment. You are paid for seeing the environment you are actually in. Let me put us this one step further, because this is where intelligent people often fool themselves. They say, "I am not reckless. I am not chasing trends. I am simply waiting this out in a money market fund or a government bond ladder until things settle down." That sounds rational. In a normal environment, it can be rational. But if the settlement mechanism itself is the problem, then waiting inside that mechanism is not caution. It is exposure. You are making a directional bet that policymakers can preserve confidence faster than they destroy it. That is still a bet. It just does not feel like one because the account statement looks calm. I learned long ago that calm statements can hide violent real losses. If your account earns 4 or 5% and your true loss of purchasing power is closer to 8, 10, or 12, once you include the things you actually buy, then your statement is not reporting your gain. It is disguising your erosion. That is why so many people feel richer in nominal terms and poorer in lived terms at the same time. Their figures rose, their freedom did not. The old bond bull market trained several generations to believe that government debt was the adult answer to uncertainty. Yields fell for decades. Prices rose. Balanced portfolios benefited. Credit expanded. Property values levitated. It all felt orderly. A great many careers were built on the assumption that this would remain the background music forever. I would be very careful with that assumption. Now, if we are in the opening stage of a secular reversal, then a great many portfolios are not merely a little suboptimal. They are philosophically misbuilt. They are arranged around the idea that nominal claims issued by increasingly indebted governments deserve pride of place. I do not believe that is the winning idea in the environment now forming. And there's another reason I dislike the bond refuge story. When the state is under pressure, it does not just affect prices. It affects incentives. More debt issuance means more competition for private capital. More pressure on the central bank means more temptation to suppress yields or refill liquidity. More fiscal strain means more need to keep the public domesticated inside approved channels of saving. The entire architecture starts leaning toward preserving the issuer, not the saver. Whenever issuer and saver interests diverge, do not assume the saver wins. The issuer writes the rules. That is why I prefer to own things that can negotiate with inflation rather than things that must submit to it. A good business with pricing power can adjust. A mineral deposit does not care about a policy speech. A productive farm does not require an inflation statistician's blessing to remain useful. A well-bought property in the right place can reprice with a currency. Gold and silver do not promise yield, but they also do not promise what they cannot deliver. They simply sit outside the confidence game. That is more valuable than many people appreciate, until the confidence game begins to wobble. The place I would rather be is in scarce and productive things. I would rather own shares of businesses that make real goods and can adjust prices. I would rather own resources. I would rather own select property. I would rather own gold and silver as monetary insurance. I would rather own claims on actual production than claims on a government's promise to preserve purchasing power while that same government is actively undermining it. That does not mean every stock wins. It does not mean every house is a bargain. It does not mean every commodity producer is a genius investment. But it does mean the category matters. In a crack-up, boom, the biggest losers are often holders of paper promises that yield a little while purchasing power disappears a lot. The better protected people are usually the ones who own things the world still needs, things that can be repriced, things that cannot be diluted with a keystroke. And before anyone tells me I am exaggerating, let me bring this back down from macroeconomics to ordinary life. I recently looked at a simple jar of instant coffee. The last large one cost 7.99 pounds for 300 grams. Then the larger package disappeared, and in its place sat two smaller containers, 95 grams each, priced at 4.19 pounds apiece. Two of them cost more than the old larger version while giving materially less product. That is not a theoretical inflation debate. That is a daily life transmission mechanism. That is what it looks like when companies know the customer notices the number more slowly than the shrinking size. That is shrinkflation doing the work that headline inflation cannot hide forever. The arithmetic on that kind of change is not subtle. You are paying far more for less and being invited to call it normal, because the sticker shock has been broken into smaller pieces. The same thing appears everywhere. Once you begin looking, restaurant meals that used to include sides now make you buy the sides separately. Sauces become line items. Air travel becomes a menu of charges layered on top of what used to be a ticket. Basic convenience goods at the corner shop suddenly feel like luxury purchases. None of these individual moments top the evening news together. They tell you the truth more clearly than the evening news ever will. They tell you the currency is weakening faster than the official narrative admits. And here is the dangerous behavioral turn that follows. At first people complain, then they adjust, then they begin buying ahead. That is when the situation can accelerate. If households start believing that today, shelf price will look cheap compared with next month. Shelf price, they begin stocking up. They hold more inventory at home. They bring purchases forward. They stop treating money as something to hold and start treating it as something to unload. That shift in psychology is the hinge between ordinary inflation and a much uglier dynamic. Once enough people behave that way, their behavior itself intensifies the shortage and price pressure. The fear becomes self-reinforcing. That is the essence of the crack. Boom, people do not need a textbook to participate in it. They only need repeated exposure to a currency that buys less, a government that promises more, and a set of real-life examples that teach them not to wait. At that point, even those who do not understand the theory begin acting on the reality. And when that starts, the authorities usually do the only thing they know how to do. They try to hold the public inside the system. They encourage saving. They glorify government paper. They defend the respectability of the old playbook. They urge calm. They redefine inflation. They tell you patience is wisdom. Sometimes patience is wisdom. But patience with a debasing unit of account can simply be a more elegant way of becoming poor. The investor's job is not to repeat respectable phrases. The investor's job is to preserve and grow purchasing power. If that means departing from the old habits of the crowd, so be it. If that means holding less currency than your grandparents thought proper, so be it. If that means understanding that an interest rate below the true loss of purchasing power is not a reward but a penalty, so be it. I am not telling anyone to panic. Panic is expensive. I am telling you to see clearly. There is a difference. See clearly that inflation is not a thunderstorm drifting in from nowhere. See clearly that governments facing impossible obligations nearly always prefer monetary dilution to outright discipline. See clearly that cash and long government paper are safest only in environments where the currency itself is trustworthy. See clearly that once trust in the currency starts weakening, real and scarce assets begin to behave differently from nominal claims. See clearly that the small daily signs matter: the shrinking package, the added fee, the rebased quality, the higher quote for the same experience. These are not random annoyances. They are the public face of a deeper policy choice, and then ask the only question that matters: what am I actually storing my life? Work in if the answer is a number in a bank account earning less than the rate at which my purchasing power is being eroded. That is not saving. It is surrender. If the answer is long government paper issued by a state that must choose between debasement and political pain, that is not prudence. It is misplaced trust. If the answer is ownership of productive businesses, selected hard assets, and monetary insurance against policy failure, then at least you are playing the right game. That game is not comfortable. It requires thought. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to look wrong before you are proven right. But it is still a better game than hoping bureaucrats suddenly rediscover restraint after decades of proving they will not. I would rather own what survives the debasement than hold what is being debased. That has been one of the great investment truths of my lifetime. And if we are indeed moving from the phase of managed perception to the phase where the public begins to understand what is happening, then that truth is about to matter a great deal more than most people realize. When the masses finally prefer goods to currency, when they start wanting anything but the unit itself, the comfortable labels disappear very quickly. The saver learns he was speculating on policy. The bondholder learns he was lending long against a weakening standard. The prudent household learns that prudence without regime awareness is not prudence at all. That is why I keep coming back to the same principle. Do not anchor on nominal safety. Anchor on real purchasing power. Do not ask whether the number is stable. Ask whether the life the number can buy is stable. Do not ask whether the state will pay you back. Ask what they will pay you back in. And above all, do not wait for the final headline to tell you the currency problem has arrived. By the time the headline is obvious, the smart adjustment phase is usually over. The early phase always feels arguable. The late phase feels undeniable. Money is made and protected in the arguable phase. Pain is concentrated in the undeniable phase. I would much rather do my thinking while things are still arguable. That is the whole point.